Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the 2021 Data for Good Exchange event hosted by Bloomberg and J.P. Earlier today, hopefully you saw the importance of good data quality and how to engage effectively with your audience, looking at visualization. In today's session, we have a spotlight on descriptive analytics, and I'm joined by our two experts here from J.P. and Bloomberg. So firstly, Julie Rombom, who is a data analyst in the third-party index team at Bloomberg, and Ganesh Chandraskar, who is an executive director in the cross-functional applied AI and machine learning team at J.P. Throughout the session, please do ask some questions in the chat. We'll have some time to go through those at the end of the session. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Julie to kick us off.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Sorry, just waiting for the slides to come up. So I know you guys have had many sessions the last few days, so thank you for joining ours. We're going to be talking to you about descriptive analysis. So you might not know what that means, but we'll tell you everything. And then by the end, hopefully you'll have a good understanding of it. So to begin, what is descriptive analytics? So descriptive analytics is your data analyzation process. So a typical data analysis workflow might look something like you start off, you identify a problem or a gap, something that needs to be fixed. And then the next thing you might do is consider, which data might be helpful to solve this problem. And then lastly, once you gather that data, you're going to analyze it. So that's like the process. So things that are important to keep in mind here are being aware that the data that you may need may not always be available to you, might not be easy to capture. Another thing is the end goal is still to make the best decision with the information that is available to you. So even though you might have certain information, certain data, it might not match with like what you thought was the best conclusion. So always use like your brain as well, in addition to the data. And then the last thing is to understand limitations of the data. So data comes with certain biases, and there's all these implied things in the data that we need to understand before we can just go into and start analyzing it. So to summarize, what conceptually descriptive analytics is an attempt to summarize the past using data. Now I'll pass it to Ganesh to wrap this up.
Cool. Thanks, Julie, and thanks for having us here, and thanks for joining. To kind of continue with her train of thought, what does it really help you achieve, right? So I think there's two interlocking things when you think about descriptive analytics. One is, in the real world, you're making decisions under uncertainty. On most important decisions that you need to make, there's a lot of randomness involved, both in the way in which data is collected and both in the way outcomes play out, right? So when you analyze data, you have to keep in mind that there's an overhang of uncertainty that you need to account for when you make decisions. So question then really becomes, how do you make good decisions combining the best of human judgment and limited data? Data is almost always limited, right? The second thing is, how do you achieve more with less? So why is this whole thing important? Why should you even care? It's because as an agent, you're trying to achieve something and you're often constrained. You're constrained on money, you're constrained on time, you're constrained on people. How do you take the same thing that you have, but achieve as much as you can out of it? And one way in which data helps you move in that direction. Now, having said that, there are lots of pitfalls to descriptive analytics and data analytics in general. And the way we thought it would be useful to articulate this would be through case studies. So if you can go to the next slide. So before we go into the case studies, right, quickly putting it into practice. I mean, we wanted to make sure we kind of ground this in what it might feel like. This is our best attempt at thinking about what it might feel like to do this in the context of a NGO or a charity. So I'm going to start off by laying out some principles, and then I want to get into some of the strategic levers we thought would be useful to discuss in this context. So the foundational principle above all is, right, as intellectual sounding as these discussions might sometimes feel, the reality is it's mostly about pain bearing. Let me explain what I mean, right? Being data savvy often demands lots of culture shifts, not just within your own organization, but with almost every organization you deal with. And there's a reason for that. It's not natural to us. We are human agents. We all have our biases, and not just at individual levels, but also at collective levels. And you're not doing it right unless it's painful. So if you want to start on the journey around data analytics and incorporating data into how you make decisions, if you're finding that there's almost no friction, it's possible that you're not dealing with important problems. So I almost use pain as an indicator that you're doing something right. And I think it's important to keep this in mind. Now, having said that, if you want to think about some of the major areas where you have strategic leverage, or you want to use these as a way of thinking about how to achieve more with less, we thought of it along 4 axes. One is fundraising. So obviously, if you're an NGO or a charity, pretty much any organization, you spend quite a bit of time fundraising. It's important to have the money to be able to achieve what you need. And fundraising usually takes 2 forms in a charity. It's the business-to-business version, or it's a B2C version. And the reason we split this up is the use of data analytics and descriptive analytics along these two end up being slightly different. Now, let's take the example of B2C. The use of data there is much more intuitive and obvious. If you're raising money from the general public, the ability to target the right groups at the right time to maximize the likelihood that they're likely to give you donations is a kind of a science problem. You collect data about people, you have data on demographics, and then you figure out how to use data in such a way as that to make sure that you maximize the likelihood to raise enough money to achieve what you need. In the case of B2B, it gets a bit more interesting because it really depends on who you're trying to raise money from. What we are observing is B2B is very idiosyncratic. So if you're raising money from an institution that tends to have its own way of thinking about how to allocate money, some of these groups may have their own processes, but an increasing number of these institutions, including the government, want to see data-driven pitches as to why your charity and not somebody else. So what we're observing is, while it's obvious in B2C, in B2B, it's increasingly important that when you're pitching for more money, that you have some kind of data to back that claim. So that's a fundraising as a pillar. The second pillar we identified was opportunity identification. Assuming you've raised the money you need to raise, and keeping with the theme that you're keeping. So, you could be a charity about diabetes, you could be a charity about school lunches, whatever your theme is, assuming you have an X amount of money, you're trying to figure out what is the right places to deploy it. And there are far too many problems in the world and not enough money to go around. So being good about how to identify those is a non-trivial task. So here's where something like descriptive analytics can help you. So if you're targeting for a given problem, if you want to know if it's better deployed in, say, one part of the country rather than the other, there's a lot of data out there increasingly about demographics that can potentially help you channel your energies and your money in the right direction, assuming the same amount of money. So that's opportunity identification for you. The third one is an interesting and emerging one, which is fairness and compliance. So assuming you're doing the first two, there's an increasing amount of, let's take them one at a time. So fairness and compliance are related but somewhat different concepts. There's an increasing amount of attention being paid to equitable outcomes. So regardless of what you're doing, you want to make sure that the money or the efforts that are being put out don't have a skew in terms of which demographics benefit if it's not a justified skew. So if you're a cancer charity, let's say, you want to make sure that the money that is being sent out or the kind of marketing that's done isn't missing out on some important groups. That may actually be a systemic bias in how we operate in general, right? So there's a lot of energy that's being put into identifying it for existing processes, not just for charities, but even for corporations, around how their energies are spent and whether they are spent equitably. So that's the fairness component. Here again, data is very important. How you collect it, how you analyze it becomes very important. And then there's compliance. So compliance, I'm sure, to tie this back to some of the earlier conversations, there's an increasing amount of regulation around everything from how data is held to fair lending to predatory marketing. And it's very important that whatever you do keeps all of this in mind, both from an ethical perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective. Here again, data is very important because the regulations themselves are often publicly available, and the ability to codify some of this into your ecosystem often involves data analytics. And then finally, operational effectiveness. So assuming you're doing the first three, the ability to do as much as you can given an existing operational setup, be it within your own organization or be it on an organization you're trying to support. How do you make it most efficient? how do you achieve as much as possible within the constraints is a topic unto itself. And you can see that these are 4 pillars, somewhat interlocking in nature, but also worth discussing independently in and of itself. I'm going to do 3 quick tips before we do a poll. So the first tip is, if you're getting started on, particularly if you're getting started on this journey, which to be fair, a lot of you are already very advanced in this journey. I know that, for example, survey analysis is a very rich topic in the context of many charities, but I'm sure some of you are getting started on this journey, particularly if you're early on it, identify a data champion. Again, it's a recommendation. The reason we think that is because this topic is so intertwined with all other topics that it's hard to extricate it from the company or the organization's working. So the best way to render the right solution is to make sure there's an identified data champion who can champion this cause in all the meetings. Now, this person does not have to be a full-time employee, and this person doesn't even have to be an employee for that matter. Like, it just has to be someone who understands what you do, who interacts with you in some frequency so that they can be effective. The second tip we have is identify a key flagship project. So starting out is really hard. Like with most things, starting on a new journey is really hard, and everything is against you when you start something new. So what's really important in the early phase of anything is to identify the right flagship projects. That which is both deliverable, that which will have visible impact, but that which is also practical, to make sure that you don't have early failures that sets you back. The final tip I have is, and this is something that's kind of undertapped in general, not just by NGOs and charities, but in general, is there's an increasing amount of publicly available data. So most governments just now make data available publicly in fairly mineable form. I know the UK government does it. I know the US government does it. It could be everything from like demographic data to disease data to even data on wildlife, depending on what your goal is. And often it ends up being underutilized because we end up going out conducting a survey before checking if somebody has already done this for you. So I would really recommend that you go through. I mean, in fact, if you just Google publicly available data sets, there's a long list of websites. And you'll be surprised to find that some of the data you might really need already exists somewhere. So if you can quickly go to the poll. I'm going to read it for everyone's benefit, but feel free to answer it anyways. Of the 4 levers that I did mention, what is the most important lever as you see it for your organization? We'll give it 10 more seconds, I think. Okay, we have the results. That's interesting. That's a fairly skewed result. So it's interesting that most of you said operational effectiveness, and the answers for the other ones are a bit more mixed. What's actually interesting about the operational effectiveness answer is that one of the challenging things about operational effectiveness is that a lot of this comes down to how you manage your own data. So in order to be operationally effective, it's about how you collect your own data. No one else can do this for you. And sometimes that ends up being far more challenging than, say, some of the other actions. So if you can move to the next slide and hand it over to Julie.
Thank you. So as Ganesh had just mentioned, a lot of you are quite far along on your data journey, but some of you guys might just be beginning, and also some of you guys might not know where to start, even though you are already using data. So I wanted you to all kind of brainstorm thinking about your day-to-day workflow and how you could extract useful insights from that. So one example that I was going to present to you guys was potentially analyzing donor emails. So this idea came from actually a friend of mine who also works for a nonprofit, and their main line of business is to raise money for like food donation. So she's frequently doing outreach campaigns, and she's doing most of this via email. And she was suggesting that she wanted to do some type of analysis to see when are people most responsive and when are people most charitable. So is there a time of day that people are most responsive? Is there a time of the month? Is there a time of the year? So that way you could better contact those donors and not waste time contacting donors in a time when they're not frequently charitable. So this isn't necessarily applicable to just donations, right? You could use this for any type of responsiveness that you're working with, any type of external stakeholders. For instance, to give you an example from what my day-to-day looks like, I do like a live help chat with clients to help them with financial questions. And we frequently look at statistics around when there's like an earnings release or something like that. Do we need to have more people able to chat with clients? Do we need to have more people on the queue? Do we need to send out some information to the people who are on the queue prior so that everyone's aware? That way, when there is an influx or something like that, we can better manage that. So the whole point of this is to do some type of basic analysis with your day-to-day workflow to figure out, okay, how can we better manage our business, whether it is for donations or to, I don't know, understand how to contact your suppliers or something like that. So if we could go to the poll. So I just wanted to know how frequently you guys are interacting with your stakeholders, such as donors, other people, via email throughout the day. So is it seldom, a couple hours, frequently, or is it all day? Yeah, so as expected, it looks like most of you are frequently or all day. About 85% of you are pretty much using your email throughout most of the day. And so that's just pretty common in our day and age. So I think it's really important if we could understand how our emails are being used, that it would really make our day-to-day better. So if we go to the next slide. Yeah, so why are we doing this? So like I mentioned, we're using email so often throughout our day, but we rarely have time to think about if we're using it effectively because we're just emailing all day. We're not really thinking about it. But there is immense amount of data that is captured through our email exchanges. And if we are doing some type of analysis like this, we could be making better business decisions. And that's really like the core of all of this, right? Like regardless of your line of work, regardless of what your nonprofit does, you want to be the most efficient business you can be. So there's certain metrics that you can look at. So you can look at how often are your emails opened? How often are they responded to? If you are receiving donations, like how frequently do people donate to you? Do they respond to your donation emails? And so like we mentioned, if you're not far along on your data journey, it's quite simple. Like I've looked at many, like if you just go into Google and type in like email analytics, there's like lots of different softwares and packages. There's Python if you're like a little bit more advanced, or you can just use Google Analytics. It's like a really simple AI. There's different softwares if you want to, I don't know, really dig deep into that. But it's really an easy way to get started and to start playing around with some really simple data that could really impact your business in a big way. Can I get the next poll question? Yeah, so we just wanted to see, do any of you actually have an active policy of looking into your incoming and outgoing emails? So it looks like about 2/3 of you are not looking into your emails at all. So I hope that maybe this serves as some type of inspiration for you to easily start digging into some really interesting data and possibly making some really interesting conclusions as well. And like I said, making better business decisions because that's the end goal here. Now I'm going to pass it to Ganesh to talk about some data limitations.
Cool. Thanks, Julie. If you can go to the next slide. Perfect. All right. So this is going to link to a poll question, which is the question is going to be, and the question will come up, but I can verbalize it anyway before we bring it up, is how many of you recognize this picture? And what I mean by recognize this, does it kind of fire some thoughts in your mind immediately as to what this might imply, or does this just feel like a new image to you? So if you can open up the poll. Okay, that's interesting. There's about 62% no and 38% yes. Obviously, for those who recognize it, that's very good, but I'm going to assume most of you don't know what this is anyways. And then if you can go to the next slide, I want to elaborate on what this slide means. And this slide has kind of become recently mimetic iconic in the sense that this is used to demonstrate a very important concept called survivorship bias. So this is a real incident that happened during World War II. In the US. So here's what happened. So, as you can imagine, a lot of the war was fought with planes, and, planes would go out. And then what they observed is over time, the red dots that you see, there was a pattern to red dots are essentially bullets, right? So there's shrapnel, and then there's parts of the plane that seem to be dented based on bullets being fired. So you have this picture emerging around planes that are coming back to the base. And then you see that most of the bullets are clustered around these parts of the plane. So you can see that the wingtips seem to have a lot of bullets. The torso seems to have bullets, and then the kind of in the tail at the end seems to have a bunch of bullets. None of the other places seem to have any bullets, right? So, so the kind of the army looked at it, and then the Air Force looked at it rather, and then they thought about, well, if we're under a limited budget. We clearly, I mean, it's an emergency situation. We want to improve the outcome because we don't want planes going down. So why don't we reinforce the parts that look like they keep getting hit? So, I mean, if you keep having bullet holes in some parts, clearly those parts are weak, right? So you kind of use some reinforcement material to improve them. Now, this was the original idea, but there was a statistician, thankfully, they had a statistician as a full-time employee of the Air Force by his name, Abraham Wald. He kind of thought about it slightly differently. He said, look, these are the planes that are coming back, right? So let's look at all planes we sent out and not just the ones that are coming back, because clearly not all planes are coming back. And then he accounted for the fact that there's a lot of planes going out there that if they got shot in the parts that don't seem to have bullet holes, right, they're likely to actually go down. So in fact, the opposite effect is true, which is it's not the parts that have a lot of bullet holes that need reinforcement. It's precisely the parts that don't seem to have any bullet holes that need reinforcement, because those are parts that if the plane were to be shot, it collapses, it doesn't come back. So this is a very interesting graphical and historical explanation for this phenomenon called survivorship bias, which is any process that generates kind of these winners and losers to the point where the losers exit the ecosystem creates a certain bias in how data eventually manifests itself in any survey or analysis. So if you can go to the next slide. I mean, there's many examples of survivorship bias. That happens to be a very famous one because it's very easy to articulate. But let me pick out a completely different one. Is it better to fall from a greater height if you're a cat? And I don't know if this question, again, elicits certain historical connections to you, which is there used to be the kind of explanation as to why, there's all kinds of explanations, right? Cats, for example, if they fall from a great height, they're good at like turning around so that they land on their feet. There's another historical explanation that used to be offered, which is around terminal velocity, which is if you think about any object that falls through air, beyond a point of time, its velocity or speed does not increase. And that can be demonstrated using physics. But if you really think about it, none of this truly explains why the original phenomenon of people saying, you know what, if a cat fell from 5 floors, it's more likely to have bigger injuries than when a cat falls from 10 floors. This is kind of this kind of myth that used to be spread out and used to be widely believed. And the explanations offered were from physics, the explanation offered were from other areas. But if somebody did a very interesting study eventually, which is they thought about how this belief came to be. And it turns out the reason these beliefs came to be was they looked the people who registered injuries with vets. So there's a log of people coming into a vet saying, my cat is injured, can you help? Right? And then they collected this data across, let's say, the United States. And then it turned out there were some clusters of injuries that you saw. For example, you would see a lot of injuries for 5. And then it looked like sometimes that seemed to be the case that, if you fall from 5 floors, you have a lot of injuries, right? But there's a kind of subtle explanation here, which is if your cat did fall from 20 floors, it probably dies, and nobody brings a dead cat to a vet. People bring an injured cat to a vet. So this is, again, a great demonstration of survivorship bias, which is the data that's presented to you has a skew due to what survives, and that may not be what is actually true. And it's very important that you account for this explicitly when you analyze data. Now, this is one example, but there are many related biases in this space. So there's biases are a complex topic onto itself, but I thought I will highlight 3 biases. I mean, this is, again, I encourage you to read up online about this. There's plenty of examples. And the 3 examples that I thought was very relevant to your space was, one is volunteer bias, which is, any survey that you conduct, anytime you go out to seek information, there's a bias in who actually volunteers information. Now, we all instinctively know that, but it's important to rigorously and methodically correct for it when you draw conclusions. When you go pose a question, people don't respond equally. Some of the most motivated people who respond may have their own reasons for being motivated, and it may not represent the full picture around who has problems or who has issues. So that's volunteer bias for you. Observer bias is a kind of the inverse of it, which is based on the person collecting information, the kind of answers you get are very different. So, particularly if it's not a depersonalized survey, if you're going out to the field to ask questions, based on the kind of person you are, the kind of people who are likely to respond to you and the kind of responses they're likely to give you are going to look very different. I mean, there are many examples here. So frequently, in countries, for example, where people do outreach, in countries where societies are still somewhat gender segregated, who you send out to ask questions often determines who's willing to volunteer responses. And you explicitly have to account for this when you do any survey. So that's an example of observer bias. And then third one is reporting bias, which is, if you think about it as a combination of the first two, which is any act of reporting has all of these hidden biases within it. So it's important to ask, what is the report generating process that generates the report before you analyze it? So that's 3 biases for you. There's a long list of this. I encourage you to, there are plenty of resources online, I think, with real examples. So I think particularly in a space like charities and NGOs, I think it's actually very useful to be mindful of these biases as you do work. One final tip on this slide before we go to the next one, which is the way in which this becomes very critical, right? So, I mean, biases are, again, intellectual and cool and fascinating, but ultimately the thing you really need to remember as you think about your role in the world and the kind of outreach you want to do is that the people who are most in need of help may generate no data. And this is where you really have to be careful. Like all the data in the world, including the ones that are publicly available and sent out by the government, unless they're carefully collected, some of the people and entities, it may not be people, it could be animals, if you're helping animals. The entities most in need often produce no data, due to which unless you explicitly argue for them, you're going to draw the wrong conclusions. And to go back to our 4 pillars, you're going to focus on the wrong groups in terms of who needs help, given limited money. If you can move to the next slide. So this is a different topic, but again, interesting one because this comes up, it rears its ugly head in a number of different places. So again, this is something very important to internalize. It's something called Simpsons Paradox, which is when a trend, what you observe is when you have a bunch of data, right? You observe a trend on the broader data set, but when you subset the data, you often see that the opposite trend is held. And you often find this with real data, and it can be very confusing as to why this is the case. So let me give you a concrete example of this. You're going to find that this is true across the board, unless the experiment is run carefully or unless the data is collected carefully. And I'll also explain why this has become more important in how we interpret things, right? So to give you a concrete example of how Simpsons Paradox works, right? They kind of did a study. So this was a kind of a medical study to figure out, for those with kidney stones, there's a variety of treatments around how you resolve kidney stones. Let's say we have 2 major treatments that are being proposed. There's treatment A and there's treatment B. And then what you have is, let's say, way to characterize the nature of the stone so that we have slightly different strategies for both. So you can have either a small stone, maybe something that can be passed, versus a large stone which requires a lot of medical intervention, right? So what they did was they wanted to compose a study to understand which treatment strategy works best. So here's the results they found. Again, this is simple analysis. It's like, you can just look at the number of patients admitted, how many of them had small stones, how many of them had big stones, how many were given treatment A, how many were given treatment B, and then analyze the success rate of each of these treatments. And in the table drawn out, these are the kind of conclusions they reached. So, for example, for treatment A, if you look at treatment A for small stones and large stones, you find that, if you let's take small stones, right? If you take small stones and you compare treatment A versus treatment B, what's more likely to work? It looks directionally as though treatment A is better because it's 93% effective, right? So that's kind of the phenomenon for small stones. Then you look at large stones, and you look at large stones and think, well, it's 73% effective if it's treatment A, and it's only 69% effective if it's treatment B. Now, what do both of these phenomena suggest? They suggest that treatment A is directionally probably better for small stones and large stones, right? It seems to hold for both. But then let's step back a little bit, combine the data, and think about which treatment works better. It's the same data, it's just aggregated differently, right? If you combine the two results, you get the opposite directional result, which is that if you look at it, treatment B is 83% effective, and treatment A is only 78% effective. This is just simple arithmetic. Like there's no, even if you just do the addition for yourself, you're going to find this to be true. So what's going on here? So a stone is either large or small. So if it's true that for large or small stones, treatment A is better, why is it that if you stop caring about the distinction, you're getting the opposite treatment to be recommended? This is a great example of Simpsons Paradox. And there are many situations where this turns up. There's a couple of remediations for it. If you're the designer of the experiment, there are ways to make sure you collect data in such a way that you avoid this kind of issue. But in many cases, because you don't have full control over the experiment, you just have to be careful about how you interpret data that's given to you. You have to subset it in various ways and think about whether the same phenomenon holds, for example. And to the right, for example, you see the visual interpretation of the same phenomenon, which is the dotted line is the broad phenomenon, the blue and red line are the subsetted data sets, and then you get essentially a line that looks in the opposite direction based on how you subset it. Now, why is this important? I'm going to tie this back to something all of us are doing increasingly, which is looking at equity of outcomes, right? And here's what gets interesting, which is you take a large phenomenon and you see how you're thinking about it, and then you subset it by various groups to see if you may potentially have subtle biases in how you're providing treatment or whatever it is. You might very well find very confusing results within it if the experiment is not designed explicitly. So be very careful about interpreting historical data where the goal wasn't to explicitly design an experiment to test bias. So if you just look at a historical collection of data and you try to cut it and pivot it and see what comes out of it, you'll often find phenomena that makes no sense or is counterintuitive. So it's very important to be careful about interpreting it, and a safer way to make interpretations on these topics may be to conduct an experiment carefully yourself. And then below you have a link to Simpsons Paradox, yet again, rich topic. In fact, one of the early public, the reason the general public got very aware of this topic was, I think they were studying admissions in UC Berkeley at some point, and then they found that different departments, if you look at it in aggregate, it looks like the admission process favors men. But if you look at it per department, it looks like many departments actually explicitly favor women. And people are very confused as to what really was happening here. And it turns out that unless you design the experiment explicitly, it's going to be very hard to use historical data to reach a directional conclusion. If you can go to the next slide.
So
I'm going to hand it over to, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks, Ganesh. I was going to say that was really interesting. All of those different biases and paradoxes, really, really super cool. So to conclude, the first part of it is obviously the art of decision making. So data is a tool, and that's like the biggest takeaway from this presentation that we want you to take away. It's there to help you. It's an enhancement, but it's also it's not the answer. And from the other aspect of it, ignoring the data, which is potentially easily accessible or not easy to access, but very useful, can leave gaps in your understanding and your analysis. So it's important to to use the data, but to not overuse it as well. Ganesh?
Cool. Thanks for that. And then to kind of wrap this slide up, one of the topics, one of the underlying themes of all that we have brought up today is the art of navigating uncertainty. Data is not data. Data is a underwhelming representation of the real world. I think that's important to keep in mind. And the real world is fraught with noise and fraught with uncertainty. So it's very important to navigate that carefully as we make decisions. So a couple of key points to keep in mind. One is all of this is a different way of saying the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. So if it's missing in your data, it doesn't mean it's not there. It simply means that we may not have collected it. So I think it's important to champion the data that's not there when you do analysis. If you think about the survivorship bias as an example of this statement. The second thing is data can be very tricky. Now, look, we are entering a world where people talk about AI, people talk about advanced modeling, and while all of this is very positive developments, one of the things that we need to ground ourselves in is even if the only operations you do is collect data, add, subtract, multiply, and divide, which is something all of us do all the time, there are many mistakes you can make in this process. And in fact, all that we've demonstrated today are things that you can get wrong with just this, without even making it more advanced. So it's important to ground yourself in what the limitations of these methods are and to be very transparent as you think about making decisions. If you can go to the next slide. Questions?
Great, thank you so much, Ganesh and Julie, for taking us through descriptive analytics, understanding what it is. So just to recap there, an attempt to summarize the past using data, and really what does it help you achieve, as well as obviously going through some of those pitfalls and biases. It was super interesting to hear. So we've got some interesting questions coming through. You shared some examples of where you have used descriptive analytics, but do you have an example where you applied analytics and found something you weren't expecting? Ganesh, I'll hand that one to you.
Interesting. So without revealing too much, this is from a prior job to kind of use to kind of simplify the example a little bit, right? One of the great things we find is when you, it's actually related to another paradox, which is when you find that there is a fence on a process. So let's say there's a checker on a process before you do something. What often happens is that you believe that when there's a checker added to a process, you have fewer errors, right? That's what the typical expectation is. But we often found case studies in the past where we collected data and we found that the opposite is true. And if you think about why this is happening, when people know there's a checker, they're less careful. And the checker also is not very careful. So when you know there's no one checking, you end up getting lower errors because people have higher accountability. So this is where you have to be careful. In places where people have complex motivations, it's very important to not just go with your belief, but think about empirically what's true, because there may be something underlying it that's causing it.
Super interesting, thank you. And then Julie, this is one for you. I think when you were talking about the email analytics, you shared some tools, and one of the questions from the audience here is, how do you decide which tools to use, especially as a non-profit? How do you kind of find the value for money?
Sure. So I think that's a great question. I think it depends on your certain limitations. So whether that's technical limitations. So if you're like a little bit more technically savvy, then I would suggest maybe using the Python code, because it might work with different like email softwares, or you might be able to like crack into different emails that you use. Whereas Google Analytics is quite easy to use and access and very user-friendly, but it only works with Gmail. So obviously if that's a limitation, if you're not using Gmail, and then there are softwares as well, but those cost money. So if you're like willing to pay for that, then sure. But I mean, if you have the technical abilities, then I would say that Python is a great option for you, especially if you understand it. And Python is quite easy as well to look up online, and there's like tutorials and Stack Overflow. It's very helpful. And then as well as like time is another limitation, right? Like you might have the technical capabilities, but it might just be more quick for you to do it over with Google Analytics, because it's usually like a nice like UI and it's like very clean. But then you just don't get the flexibility that you get with Python.
That's super interesting. And Ganesh, would you add any other tools or techniques to that?
I would say that, first of all, I agree with Python increasingly becoming almost convergent with expressible, easy language. It's almost getting to the point where you don't need to be a programmer to really understand it. And I think that's a very positive development. I would combine Python with, again, Stack Overflow. Every problem has been solved before. You're not solving any new problems. You're taking a problem somebody else has solved and then tweaking it a little bit. In fact, I think most learning has reduced to, are you good at searching for things in Google? So I think it's very important to keep that in mind. People sometimes feel like they're underqualified to do something and feel daunted by these things. But really, if you know how to Google stuff, it's quite easy. And I would tie this back to another point, which is around tying this to data sets, which is, it's very hard to do this kind of data analytics without a motivating business problem or a problem and a data set that can help you get there. And it's very hard to do it in the abstract. So what I would recommend is take a problem you care about, see if we have some internal and open source data about it, Google as much as you can to find out if somebody has solved a variation of this problem, basically copy that code, change one thing at a time, see what works. And then I think that's a very easy way to not just accomplish your goals, but also learn in the process.
Thank you so much for that. So that ties nicely into the next question we have coming in through here. So working for a charity, we often use data to confirm the work we do in some ways has an underlying confirmation bias. What are your thoughts and suggestions do you have to kind of challenge this? Where is there a pressure to collect that data and appease funders, but also how do you actually use that data and find value in it?
Really good question. I have a very long answer, but I'm going to give you the short answer. So I think if you think about it, right, if you're a charity, you end up being in two situations typically. Your initial belief about the world causes you to start a charity, right? You could believe some things are underserved, and then that causes you to start one or join one. And then what ends up happening over time is one of two things happen. One is you find yourself in a minority belief, there's simply it's not even a fashionable belief. You find yourself one of the few people in the world really fighting for a cause, whatever it might be. And then you have data or no data against it. What I would recommend is be very careful of situations where there's this kind of groupthink. It's less about the data itself. If there's a belief that everyone seems to hold and no one challenges it, this is particularly where you need to be careful about seeking counter evidence to this kind of bubble-like belief. But on the other hand, if you find yourself to be a small player trying to establish yourself, I would not worry too much about whether you need to find data to go against your own belief, because what actually happens in practice is that things are set up against you anyways. So you try your best. And if it turns out that what you're trying to do is not germane to the situation, you eventually find out anyway. So the reason I give this kind of nuanced answer is because the real world often has situations where beliefs reinforce data. So the data is not just data. What you believe to be true often ends up being true because of how many people believe it. And that's where when you have to interpret things in socioeconomic situations or things like, if you believe that some school kids are if you believe that they're going to do well, let's say prior belief, this is not based on their historical beliefs. If you all suddenly believe that these school kids are going to do well, people have run experiments like this before, and you acted as though they're going to do well, sometimes it ends up simply being true. And that's where, if you just analyze the data for both cohorts historically, your recommendation would have been there's no difference between the groups. But because they were surrounded by people who believed something to be true, the outcomes ultimately ended up being different. Now, I know it's a bit of a complicated answer, but where I would be most careful is when you find yourself in a situation where there's a lot of groupthink, everybody seems to be X to be true, and that's where you need to be most careful about arguing against it.
That's fantastic, thank you. And then Julie, a question for you. In terms of what would be your kind of top tips for how do you start and where do you find that data? How do you know what is most relevant when you're looking through that data to begin with?
So I suppose it depends on what data you're referring to. If we are still talking about the emails, I think it depends on what is important to you. So if you are, and that really goes for any problem, whatever is the most important thing to you, that's probably where you should start. And you might not find the conclusions that you're looking for necessarily there, but you might find really other interesting insights. by digging in. Like you have to start somewhere essentially. So maybe start where you know, start where you maybe have some expectation of how the data will look, and then either it might, be confirmed, or you might actually be pleasantly surprised by like a different outcome that arises, and that could lead to a lot of different insights. So if we're talking about the emails, for instance, and I'm a nonprofit, particularly looking into raising money, then I might want to see how frequently people are responding when I send an email about like asking for donations or something like that. But if that's not particularly important to me, then I probably really wouldn't start there. So it really kind of depends on what your end goal is, and then I think work off of there, because yeah, like I said, you have to begin somewhere. And I think the scenario that occurs a lot with people who frequently look at large sets of data is that the conclusion that they were expecting is not what they went in thinking, and the problems that they solved were not necessarily ones that they were like going in expecting to find.
No, that makes perfect sense. So Ganesh, I think this is one for you. Could you, you shared at the beginning around tips about being a data champion. Could you describe in a bit more detail the role and how you sort of identify a good data champion?
No, I mean, this is a good and evolving, I have an evolving answer to this, but I'll give you my best guess at the moment. I think what you're going to find is one of three things, right? If you're a typically large charity, you either end up in a situation where you need like CTO equivalent, a chief data officer. Most large entities eventually end up needing something like this. So I think for the larger ones, typically the maturation process of any company or entity allows you to find that person to be this full-time internal employee who kind of connects to all the endpoints. The answer for the medium-sized and smaller ones are a bit more complex in the sense that obviously if you're a very small entity, it's very hard to afford a full-time anything. Let alone someone who is kind of very specialized in an area, and you have to recruit someone who is willing to work for you full-time. So it doesn't work out practically for a lot of reasons. So one phenomenon I'm observing is the increasing use of things like non-executive director roles. Of a person specialized in an area who can kind of chime in every quarter, who's sufficiently passionate about your cause, who may not work for you full time, but because they bring in their external experience, but are sufficiently passionate about your cause and understand what you're trying to achieve in your current constraints, that person acts as the kind of entity who can slowly drive you in the right direction. This is probably going to require some experimentation. It could be non-executive memberships. It could, that's if you want someone who is a bit more persuasive. If you want someone who is a bit more, can get something done for you, I think internship programs where in addition to the traditional interns you just hire data analytics interns. I think the good thing for them is it looks good on their resume as well. It increases their network. So I think using these in clever ways to slowly bring this DNA in without expending too much cost is what I would recommend.
Okay, great. And you mentioned earlier around online resources and Googling, there's a lot out there on the web. Are there any that you could share with the audience that you think are kind of the top kind of places to go and find that information?
Stack Overflow, certainly, as Julie mentioned. I think it's particularly for very specific technical questions, Stack Overflow is fantastic. I forget the exact name of the website, but the UK government, for example, has its public data sets listed out. And it's, I think COVID was a great example of how people went in to analyze that because it was an interesting topic. You have everything cut out by region, by time, by demographics. The census data, I think some countries are very good at open sourcing their census data. There are some countries which have the equivalent of a Right to Information Act, which is, I don't know what it's called in different countries, but it means that if you want to know something about the affairs of how the government conducts business, you're allowed to ask that question and they are mandated to respond, which means that that's an easy way for you to get data. They're obliged to give you the data. The reason I actually look at open source or online resources in two ways is one is learning and methods and tools, which is kind of Python, Stack Overflow, etc. And the other one is data. Like, how do I get data, which is often the biggest challenge. But how do I get it cheaply? How do I get it such that it can help me address a number of issues?
Great. And Julie, would you add any other sources or any other resources to that?
Yeah, so personally, I'm a big fan of watching YouTube videos, which isn't like the most convenient when you have like a very specific problem. So yeah, like Ganesh said, Stack Overflow, because you can go into Google and type in like your exact problem, and probably you'll find like 8 different links on Stack Overflow of people explaining exactly their method and everything. But if you're trying to do something a little bit more basic, I personally love YouTube because I love being walked through like verbally through those resources. And then yeah, I would just say like different Python library and like catalogs, like you can read online like what different packages do. They are sometimes a little bit tougher to understand if you're like not as savvy with coding, but what you can do is look at the different packages and see like what's within it, and then start using Stack Overflow in combination with them. And that's typically how I go about doing work with Python.
Perfect, thank you. And Ganesh, you touched on a couple of the challenges around kind of fully understanding your data, and how do you account for sort of survivorship bias and Simpsons Paradox and sort of those examples. Is there an example that you could share with the audience today, or sort of within a non-profit type example where you think that these biases exist?
Interesting. I mean, the Simpsons Paradox one, as we do more of this kind of demographic-based analysis, I would encourage people to be a bit careful about making directional claims based on subsetted data, because many of these things were not sourced as a part of a carefully run experiment. They were just data that came to us, right? So there's that I've explained for Simpsons Paradox. Let me look at one on survivorship bias. I think, if you look at, very often if you look at, let's take an example around, what would be a good example? So let's say it's disease intervention, right? So if you look at which groups, particularly in the US, where their medical system is a bit different. If you look at medical data, admissions data, so on and so forth, particularly for chronic diseases, what you find is that the people with insurance go into the doctor often, and people who don't have insurance don't go check themselves in about chronic diseases. So if your problem is to solve chronic diseases, if you only look at the people who check in, first, they're the people who need the least help because they already have insurance. Second is that you're going to get a very skewed picture on the nature of chronic diseases you're finding in your demographic. This is one example. But I think the general mental framework I have for identifying this is always have a kind of almost like an adversarial method around it. So when you see something, why is it, how was this sourced? Why is this the thing? Like, is this all there is to it, or are we missing something? I think almost taking a pause to constantly reflect on whether the thing that is being offered to you is what it is I think very important. The reason this is very interesting is that it often creates this very weird tension between industrialization of a process and being careful about interpretation. So the two conflicting, I know many of you answered by saying that operational effectiveness is one of your goals, which will probably include things like streamlining how you get data, streamline data, present data, and reach conclusions. But the problem with that, though, is every step that you do that is automated means that there was no group of people sat in the middle thinking, was this okay? So you need to draw kind of there's this tension between being careful about how assumptions are introduced into the ecosystem at every step by arguing for the thing that's not present, and also not making it so cumbersome that you can't run your process repeatedly. So, I mean, the long story short is the adversarial, the kind of argumentative, playing devil's advocate, or championing the things that aren't present. I think the good news, though, is I think people who are at least the people I know who like working in charities, who are actually of that persuasion, this comes more naturally to them than it comes to a lot of people who are, work in industry, because I think that's naturally part of what they need to do. So I don't think this is a big culture lift for you. It's just something to be mindful of.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So we're nearly at time. So just one last question, Julie, for you. If you could sort of say one key takeaway from today's session that you'd like the audience to go away with, what would that be?
I think the takeaway should be that don't be afraid of data, because often it seems quite daunting to work with data sets, to look into data that you maybe haven't seen before or aren't familiar with, or maybe it looks too complicated to clean up. But I think once you get started, once you realize that, okay, this is like this could be really helpful for me, for my business goals. I think that's like the really important part. Because in the end of the day, like it's really gonna make all your business decisions that much better.
Great. And Ganesh, any last takeaways?
I mean, first of all, I would emphasize Julie's point, which is don't be afraid of it. I think this is the direction the world is taking. Data is going to be cheaper to acquire. It's going to be a bigger part of the grammar of how we do things. It's just better to get used to it. Having said that, I think this is sometimes the mistake people make, which is when something is trendy, kind of suspend consensus building and common sense in the process of implementing a new technique. And it's important you don't do that. Like you always have to have the guardrails you've always had in terms of making decisions, being consultative, arguing for the thing that's not present. And as long as you don't forget your old guardrails, I think all of this new stuff can only help.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, that leaves me to say thank you so much, Ganesh and Julie, for your time today and for leading us with an engaging discussion. And hopefully everyone is going to go away and really fully understand descriptive analytics. We have lots of sessions tomorrow, so please do remember to dial in. And please do join us for the closing session with Gideon Mann from Bloomberg and our non-profit panels, which include our representatives from DataKind, Felix Project, Zero Gravity, Fair Education Alliance. And with that, just like to say thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.